Color grading is about creating consistency, it's about creating neutrality, and then at the final stages, it's about pushing in that look across the film. This course is designed to show you how you can build those things in camera, so you can give yourself that neutrality right from the outset, rather than having to push and pull your signal around to create, whites and grays and blacks before you then have to actually start pushing in looks further on. Everything about the way a camera works is informed by the way that the eye works. All of the biology and science and the study of the human visual system that has taken place over 120, 130 years has allowed us to develop cameras that mimic the way we see, from the sampling system of RGB to the way that you extrapolate complementary colors from known red, green, blue signal. Everything about that is born out of the study of the human visual system. So simple things like our perception of green and the dominance that we have towards that color perception in that area of hue, that's replicated in cameras. There are twice as many green photosites covered by the Bayer filter, the color filter array, which sits on top of all camera sensors. There are twice as many green receptors as there are red and blue. There are all kinds of things that are mimicked by cameras that work towards the way our eye works, but then there are fundamental differences as well. So for example, camera sensors are natively linear. They record light linearly, whereas our eyes don't work that way. Our eyes perceive the world in a more logarithmic fashion, so we have more sensitivity in shadows and midtone areas, and we see more detail in those areas, and we see a lot less detail in highlights, for example. So to mimic the way that our eye perceives the world around us, cameras can have power functions or transforms or gammas that can be applied to them, which will help mimic that response to tonal range that our eyes have. And log is one of those kind of buzzwords that's been around for a few years now, but it's also kind of a potentially tricky thing to work with. Essentially what you're doing when you're shooting in log is you're telling your camera to shift where it's assigning its tonal range across the image. Now that allows you to mimic more closely what the eye does, so it allows us to bring up more detail in shadow areas and reassign those steps of tonal range to areas where they're more useful to us and at the expense of areas where they're not so useful. So basically the upper kind of highlight range is really kind of crammed in. Now, at the same time, what it's trying to do is it's trying to squeeze greater dynamic range in as well, which of course also mimics the way the eye works. I can quite comfortably see detail inside this room and outside the window, whereas the camera will struggle because its dynamic range is not as great as the eye. But to help get closer to it, that's again where log can be used to compress the dynamic range into a smaller container, which you can then later on in post pull back out again. That's all well and good. However, if you're trying to shoot, let's say, S-Log3 in an A7S II, a camera which is 8 bits, 420, and yet it's got the most kind of aggressive compression that, in terms of a log curve that Sony produce, that's quite a dangerous combination, because you're actually squeezing and compressing the image to maximize its dynamic range, but then encapsulating that into a codec, which by its very nature is missing an awful lot of the data that would have originally been received by the sensor. A lot of that's gone by that point, and you're then trying to pull that back out again, and the image can start to degrade. You can have issues with noise, of course. So having a good concept and a good understanding of which gammas are most appropriate for the camera you're using and the situation you're using can go a long way into making sure that you've got a good, clean digital negative to work with later on. If you're using a higher caliber camera, so if you're spending a lot more on a camera, the post-processing and the codec that they're recording to is so much greater, and often the bit depth of the video signal is so much greater, that these things just look much better. They can handle that pushing and pulling to a much greater extent. They're also cleaner, they have a lower noise floor, so you can fall into the trap of hearing people saying, yeah, always shoot log, that's the best thing, but maybe they're using, a Amiras or Alexas or Reds or cameras which actually have the capability of recording that in so much greater detail than you might be able to achieve with the camera that you're using. So thinking about the camera that you've got and thinking about the scene that you're presenting it with. So for example, log is designed to compress greater dynamic range. Well, there'd be no point therefore using that if you're pointing your camera a low dynamic range scene. And I see that done an awful lot. There were plenty of times, for example, in our commercial where I was pointing it at quite flat scenery. There wasn't that dynamic range that would necessarily call for a log curve to be used. There's nothing wrong with flicking to different gamma profiles for the appropriate shot, particularly if you're the one that's responsible for editing and grading that stuff together come the end. You're going to have to grade it anyway, because you would have to with log anyway. So that work is still going to be necessary. What helps then is understanding how to match those shots and create continuity across shots, and that's really color grading skills. But helping yourself by choosing appropriate profiles and thinking about how you can maximize the image signal that you've got in the particular camera you've got, and making sure that if you're pointing your camera at a very high dynamic range scene, then using the appropriate gamma, or if you're pointing it at a low dynamic range scene, then using the appropriate gamma. That's going to give you the best quality image that you can work with later on in post. One of the key things you need to get right, first of all, is the very basic white point, the white balance of the image. A lot of people would assume, because we have sunlight just streaming in here, it must be 5,500 Kelvin, preset the camera to that, dial that into lights. The average color temperature is going to change, obviously, depending on the time of year, time of day, and geographically whereabouts you are on the planet. So rather than just assuming and guessing what the color temperature is, you need to measure it. A simple showing of this card where your subject is to the camera, one button press of a manual white balance, and everything will slot into place. Every single color will slot exactly where it should be. It's been designed to be completely pigment-free. So as the light comes in from outside and hits this, all of the frequencies that are hitting it are being reflected back. So if I white balance from this source, I'm going to have a very accurate, neutral starting point for my camera. So I'm just going to grab this and I'm just going to stick it on a chair for now. And you can see the sun is just catching it there. Kieran, if you step to the side, get your shadow off there. I grab my camera, I'm simply going to take a manual white balance. Every camera has a manual white balance option on there, so those two little triangles lying on their side. It's just a case of setting that and taking a sample from it. So I've got two presets I can set, which is useful if I'm going from inside to outside or moving from one artificial light source to another. I can set those two presets and shift between them nice and quickly. I'm just going to set this one up for our daylight interior that we're mainly natural lighting for this. If I point this at the target, manually white balance from that. Because you're manually sampling the light sources around you, it will show you on screen what the white point that it comes up with is, and you then have a value that you can plumb into your tunable LEDs if that's what you're using. And once my camera has told me what the color temperature is, let's say that we're getting 5,800 in the room right now, I can dial that straight into my tunable LEDs, and I now know that we're all consistent. So even the artificial light sources are falling exactly into the right color temperature rather than drifting off in different areas. As a final step though, just to make sure that anything that I record is as balanced as possible, I'm actually going to use the reverse side of this chart, particularly the color chips here, which are going to give me a saturated reference for my primaries and secondary colors. I'm just going to turn this around, set this up on here as well, and I'm just going to film a few seconds of that. We have the exposure bars in the middle, the top one being a 90% reflectance, and that's kind of standard issue white reference point for judging exposure. So you can plot that against 90 IRE if you're shooting in a standard Rec 7 line gamma. If you're shooting in log, each one will have a different value. So, and you can find this out from the manufacturer's website. So we're shooting S-Log2 right now. This 90% reflectance value therefore should fall at 59% IRE based on Sony's own white paper. Certain cameras, it is advised to slightly push that higher to clean up certain problems in the shadows, but nonetheless, purely based on the numbers alone, and according to Sony's own white paper on this, you should find that 90% reflectance falls at 59% for S-Log2, it's 61% for S-Log3, basically essentially 60%, and that's where the highlights are being compressed. So if you're shooting into standard Rec 709, it's completely easy. 90 becomes 90, really straightforward. You can use the waveform monitor, you can use zebras, you can use your histogram if you've got a reference on there. It's pretty straightforward. But using these charts in camera to help with exposure really aids consistency across multiple cameras. And if you just record a few seconds, you've then got that imprinted, and that's coming with you down the pipeline into post-production, where you can then use this, and I'll show you the technique to be guaranteeing that all of your cameras match all of the colors that they're seeing, particularly using the saturated primary and secondary colors here. You can use that lined up on the vector scope in Resolve or whatever program you use to guarantee that your image is 100% accurate. And it's so good that it'll actually even iron out any discrepancies between the basic color science of the camera that you're using. Okay, so I'm just going to launch DaVinci Resolve. This is the software that I use to do this process, but you can actually do this with the tools that are built into Final Cut Pro 10.4 and with tools like Color Finale. There's a variety of plugins that will allow you to do this. But the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure that my exposure is accurate, and I can do that by drawing a quick power window just around the exposure guidance chips that are on the front of the chart. And by drawing a mask around them, it helps isolate them in the waveform monitor, and I can then clearly place them. So I'm just going to put black down just above 0, and I'm going to put white just up underneath 896 code value. Now that equates to roughly 90 IRE. And then I'm just going to shift the gamma down just to redistribute the 20 IRE and the 40 IRE grey chips. And that's a very rough step, but that gets me basically with my exposure correct. I then move the mask across to the saturated primaries and secondary chips, just re-jiggle the mask so that they are nice and clearly defined. But the waveform's no use to me here. What I need to do is move across to my vector scope. I've just pushed in a little bit of saturation across the board to help me get started, but the real work happens in the hue versus hue and the hue versus sat controls. So the first thing I do is click on the preset secondary and primary color buttons that are along the bottom of the hue versus hue curve. And by adding those control points and moving them up and down, I can either move my reference points clockwise or anti-clockwise around the vector scope. And you can see all I'm doing here is just making sure they're pointing at the boxes that are shown in the vector scope when you're at 2x zoom. I can then go into my hue versus sat controls, and if I move these up, then I'm adding saturation to that control point. If I move them down, I'm pulling out saturation from that control point. And so by using hue versus hue to align the hues where they should be pointing, and then the hue versus sat curve to actually make the ends of those traces fall within those boxes. If you do a manual white balance in camera, you'll find it should be pretty close. How far off it starts off is down to the level of compression that's within your signal, how much color data was there in the first place, the individual color science of the camera you were using and how it post-processes the raw data off the sensor, which is very different from camera to camera. It also has a lot to do with the quality of your lighting sources in the environment that you were shooting in, your gamma curve. So for example, when you're shooting log, it will obviously desaturate the image, and that has a big knock-on effect on how much color data is left behind for you to manipulate. But if you can push those hue versus hue controls so that the hues at least line up correctly, that's 90% of the battle won. Your image then should look accurate in terms of color. If you can take the additional step of pushing saturation into the colors where it needs it, then that will also give you the vibrancy that you need. But if your signal can't take that, and a good indicator of whether or not it can or can't take that level of pushing is if the traces on the vector scope start to kind of go a bit thin and spidery. That's kind of a warning that you are
losing data, you're losing headroom really. These values are based on Rec 709 there, standard primary and secondary values. They're completely universal across all HD video signals. And so by matching these points up, you are guaranteeing you're in good shape. So if I do this exact same step on multiple cameras, then you can actually very quickly get close to matching all the cameras. So it's a very quick process. Really probably only takes about 2 or 3 minutes per chart shot that you've got, and you should be generating these chart shots at the beginning of each new setup or scene, or if there's a considerable change in lighting, it might be worth doing it again. But you can see here, I'm basically done. Everything's falling where it should do. And if I remove the mask, once I'm done, the corrections that I'm applying will then apply to the entire image, and everything will just slot into place perfectly.
These are technical considerations. These are things that, as a colorist, you're expected to know. And the colorist's role is kind of an interesting one because they're incredibly technical. They have to have a deep understanding of the science behind the way that images are produced, captured, recorded, compressed, because it helps them do their job. For example, one of the things that a colorist would be incredibly mindful of is how much color information is still left in the signal by the time they've got it. A lot of cameras that you may well own, you may not even realize, are throwing away vast amounts of color information whilst they're recording those images. A process known as chroma subsampling, for example, will chuck away either 50% or 75% of the color information that the sensor is actually capable of recording in order to compress it into a lightweight codec for working with further down. It also enables the camera to write to cheaper media, slower media like SD cards. So chroma subsampling is a really good example of where, admittedly incredibly clever algorithms are used to average out color information, replace color information, chuck away color information. Spatial compression will do the same. So these things have an impact on the digital negative. They have a big impact on what you can and can't do later on in post. And the cheaper your camera, the more likely it is that it will be doing these things. And so the more important it is that you're making sure that you're getting things as close to perfect in camera as possible, so you've got that wiggle room later on to tease out any particular colors or contrasts that you think will aid your narrative. 3 key things there. Calibrating our monitors, making sure that what we see is what we get. Using a grey card to make sure that the white point in camera is set precisely based on the ambient white point in the room that you're in or in the environment that you're in. And using tools like this to make sure that exposure is consistent and accurate, and recording a few seconds of this to make sure that we can check skin tones or color references on a vector scope. They're simple things. No one of those 3 things is going to take you more than 10, 20 seconds. But each one of them, and particularly all of them, is going to guarantee that you're getting a really high quality, neutral starting point, ready to then push further if you need to, or manipulate in the color grade to get those colors going where you want them to go. And of course, any colors that you've built into the production that are there on screen are also going to naturally appear vibrant and clear and clean and accurate. And once you start doing it, you quickly realize, how did I ever not do this in my productions before? So investing in a good chart is a really good step towards clean color management and consistency of color across all of your shots. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through a few examples, and I'm also going to take some of the stuff that we shot on our commercial yesterday and just apply some just basic color theory, really. The first thing I wanted to talk about was adding depth. One of the things that you'll find about film, about photography, about art, they're all 2-dimensional mediums. We're watching these things on 2-dimensional flat screens, TVs, cinema screens. And there's a very simple and very common trick. In fact, it's such a common trick that even as a small child, you would fall for this. And that is to add shading to 2-dimensional objects to create the illusion, or really more to kind of denote to the viewer that this is 3D. It's kind of a basic part of our visual language. So for example, if I was to draw a circle on a piece of paper and show it to you, you would call that a circle. If I were to then just shade one side of that circle, it's still a circle. It's always going to be a circle whilst it's drawn on a piece of paper, but you would almost certainly look at that and say that's a sphere, because it's obvious that my intention is to convey to you this is a three-dimensional object. So by adding that shading, I'm saying to you, trust me, this 2D circle is in fact a representative of a three-dimensional object. We kind of do that unquestioningly, and we understand that from a very early age. And we can absolutely apply the same logic to our images, both as we're lighting them in camera, but also obviously as we're color grading them, we have that opportunity to refine that. So adding depth to your image by tweaking contrast, creating key and fill sides, dark and light, playing those two things off each other, it literally creates three dimensions where there are none. And it's such a powerful but simple technique. One of the first things that a colorist would do when they get an image in front of them would be to focus on contrast first. If I just launch, I'm using DaVinci Resolve, I mean, the things I'm talking about absolutely apply to any software you happen to be using to refine and color grade your images. But if I open this up, and I've just got a few shots from yesterday, I haven't really started working on this yet, we only shot it yesterday, but it's just a few examples. So I've got a shot here, if I just play this back full screen. This is one of the shots of, this is Josh, and he's just tasting some food that he's in the middle of prepping. It's a perfectly decent shot, and actually the narrative, if you like, of him tasting his food, the care he's taking over the preparation is the important thing here. But other than that, there are still some things that I'm going to want to do. So we've got our color palette at play here. We've got the nice brown umber apron that we chose. Obviously, we've got his skin tones there. He's actually preparing a blood orange, so, you know, not an accident. Obviously, this is all part and parcel of our preparation and our planning for embedding that color palette and that mood into our film. But what I can do is I can essentially relight this, and this is one of the powerful things that we can do in color grading. There are always, as much as I've been banging on about how you can get this right in production, get the best image in camera, that takes a huge amount of discipline, and actually there's a very well-known saying, shit happens. Things go wrong, things get missed, the stress of trying to shoot stuff. As we were shooting this, the clock was ticking down. We had to hit golden hour for when they started plating the food, which means we had to work backwards 2 hours, and that was if everything went on schedule. So things were kind of, you know, on a tight schedule, even though they were well planned. And there were a few shots like this where I relied on a lot of ambient light to kind of illuminate my subject, and I knew that the colors were there to add that depth. But I can absolutely help this by pushing in color where I want it, by pushing in complementary colors, in this case it will be blue, into other areas of the screen to help them recede. Blue naturally recedes from our vision because we are so ignorant of it deliberately. As I said earlier, we've evolved to pay little attention to blue, so it naturally recedes and cool colors fall back. Warm blood colors, skin colors, they naturally come forward. So we're literally, because of the choice of color palette, we're creating depth with color. What I'm going to do here is I'm also going to add to that depth with contrast. So I'm going to do a very basic thing, nothing complicated at all. The first thing I'm going to do is actually I'm just going to add in some, as what's known as a primary pass. I'm just going to add in a little bit of contrast. I will be talking more about these kind of basic color grading principles in another course that will follow this. But so for now, I'm just going to kind of rattle through these controls without getting too caught up in them. I'm just using a control surface here just to allow me to work quickly. And let's just get our image looking something like that. So we're just doing a basic contrast pass first of all. I've got the Sumo here acting as my reference monitor, and ballpark in the right area. You'll notice without any work, the white shirt looks white. His skin tones are already, to my eye, falling in the right place. This is, again, not an accident. This is because of the work we put into white balancing, into controlling our lighting, everything we did in camera earlier that I've been banging on about to you. This is where it's starting to pay off. So I don't have to endlessly work to kind of tidy up color casts. I'm free to think about these really important but subtle details about depth and about crafting that image to give it what I'm looking for. So in this case, that kind of general contrast pass looks really nice, but I'm just going to add an additional node, and I'm going to start to relight his face. So I'm going to use a custom mask here, and what I'm going to try and do is just add a little bit more depth to the fill side, which is the sort of off side of his face here. Now, you can only push this so far, but I don't need to do much. I just want to create just a vague shape across here, up the nose, and soften that off quite a bit. So I'm essentially trying to capture a loose detail here. It's nothing remarkable. You can see as I start to pull that down, I'm actually darkening that sort of face. If I go too far, obviously that looks ridiculous. But I can actually pull quite a lot down there. And if I come for the midtones here, I can actually pull quite a lot further down. Let's just stretch this up. Something like that. And let's increase our softness. And just going to also desaturate it a little bit. So I'm darkening and desaturating. Let's go full screen. You can see that light there. Now, it looks quite stark when you're doing it like this, but there's no way you would notice that if I wasn't turning it on and off. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm gently trying to introduce this idea of a darker side, and I'm literally doing the circle on a piece of paper with some shading on the side. Ideally, I would have done that in camera, and I would have brightened up this key side, but we had to move quite fast, and I had to rely on just the big open windows giving me enough of a key. What's happened here is there's just too much spill, which obviously we can't control the spill in a room of this size, and a lot of that spill's come back onto the other side. So I'm getting that chance to kind of refine that. The other thing I can do to help draw attention to the other side is I can increase contrast as well. So I can come over to the other side and do a very similar thing. I'm going to do a much broader stroke here, bring this across here, and really soften that off, and just increase the contrast. So again, increases in contrast, they draw the eye. So I'm actually able to use the contrast to pull it across. In fact, if I do one broad change, so I'm just going to tackle him as a whole, soften that off quite a lot. Just going to track this, make sure that this tracks okay. A little bit of extra keyframe. I will not keyframe this live. Let's come back in here. Let's track this one. I'm just tracking my masks. 3D tracking and resolve is incredible. And let's come in here and track this one, which we want from there. Nice and soft. So what we end up with, if we come back to here, is I end up with the ability to punch out. So you can see as I'm adjusting the contrast, I'm actually adjusting the contrast and then the pivot point of that contrast. Let's pull that up around sort of there. Boost that color a little bit more. And you can see how I'm starting to get to a space where actually not only are we creating a kind of an appealing image that's working well, we're also starting to draw the eye. So those simple contrast changes are actually allowing me to draw people where I want them to look. One more additional thing to do here, and I'm just going to select the skin tones for this quickly. It's going to come in here. Let's just feather that off into these areas. And let's take the saturation up there. Again, doing this incredibly quickly just to get it in the right ballpark. But I can use the vector scope here and I can just check and make sure that my skin tones are not only falling in the right area, but are saturated enough to actually compete with what we're going to be doing in a second. So you can see this clear spike that's heading up towards the flesh tone line, and the level of saturation there, which I can check on the vector scope. If I come back, head off in here, I can add an inverse of that. So I'm going to basically invert that selection, and I'm going to very, very subtly push a bit more blue into that. Now, I'm not going to do much. I just want a small amount. But you can see how we're going from, obviously that's the log image, there's obviously going to be a dramatic change there, but we're actually going towards something that is starting to have a depth to it that wasn't there before. And that depth is being created by shadowing one side of the face, adding contrast to the eye, particularly on the other side of the face, contrast generally to our subject, pushing in that saturation, bringing out those kind of deep red and brown kind of colours, and then very subtly pushing in blue into the other areas to recede. And I'm literally pumping up the bits I want to pump up, and I'm deflating the bits I want to deflate, and I'm starting to get a kind of a shape to this animal that's kind of inviting. And your kind of goal really is to make the viewer feel like they're there. And you're trying to trick people. You're trying to trick them into thinking that this is a three-dimensional scene that they're part of. Okay, I've rushed through that for your benefit, but with some actual effort, I can make this really convincing, particularly relighting faces. You can actually make that incredibly convincing and start to create depth where you might have missed an opportunity in production. So that's how you can color grade to add depth using contrast. This is my kind of interpretation of it just quickly in the stuff that we shot yesterday, but I just want to quickly take you through a really good example of where I think this is incredibly successful, which is the crown. So I've just got some screen grabs here. I just think that this is such a great example of the use of contrast to create depth and to really draw the viewer in. The big kind of feature of the crown, if you haven't seen it, is very large interior spaces, palaces, big spaces, and quite often the Queen, Claire Foy, appearing quite small within that space. And kind of it's great the way it kind of conveys that weight on her shoulders. And so contrast is used really effectively here. Big windows often used, almost always terminating in a bright, clipped area at the back as well. So there's often an extreme white point reference at the far end of the room that they're in, or if it's not at the far end, there'll be repetitions of it leading the eye away. So there's this high contrast point that literally takes you to the deepest part of the physical space and then kind of lets you work back out and around that. And it just works so effectively. This is the Queen Mother in her talking to one of the aides. Again, big window over on the right-hand side, lots of natural light coming in, lit just beautifully, absolutely stunning. And these shafts of light picking up the key characters and allowing the depth and the volume to really be apparent within the space. Here's another one, that big clipped window at the end there. Actually, if you watch this in HDR, it's not clipped. If you're lucky enough to have a 4K HDR TV and have Netflix HDR, what you'll find with these is there is actually color detail in there. There is no actual detail, and that's very deliberate, but there is a very nice soft clip and color roll off. So certain times of day are denoted by the color shift towards it, but it's very deliberately washed out to give you an extreme area of contrast to pin your vision, either centrally to enhance a symmetrical composition, or just simply to draw your eye right to the back of the room and then come back out from there. It's a really clever way of allowing you to explore the three-dimensionality of the space that you're in. Again, here you can see the colour starting to creep in. The princesses here in their pyjamas. You've got that golden hour colour light coming in through, again, large window. And you'll also notice here that key characters are placed in front of those areas. Placement of high contrast is used in two very effective ways in the crown. It's used to backlight and silhouette, to a certain extent, key bits of action or key characters. And it's also used to draw the eye to the back of the room to then kind of enhance that three-dimensionality. Again, with this space, this one's really interesting because these areas of high contrast have been used in a symmetrical but essentially flat composition. This isn't a shot that's been used to convey depth and scale. It's actually a more intimate scene of heavily reliant on the dialogue between Princess Margaret and the Queen. But what they're using instead is they're using firelight in the middle to draw your eye centrally. That helps support the kind of an anchor, the symmetry of the scene. But you can see we've got two practicals, one just off from the Queen and one just off from Princess Margaret. And those practicals essentially belong to them. They're two lights that pin your eye, and that contrast is being used to balance and draw you to certain key action within the frame. Such an important part of storytelling with contrast, which is part and parcel of both obviously in production and lighting and the DOP job, but also in terms of enhancing that as a colorist. So for example, if one of these lights was brighter than the other, the colorist could tackle that. If you needed in this scene there to be balance, maybe they're having a disagreement and you don't want a clear winner, you don't want the viewer to take a particular side, it would be very important that these lights, these practicals, were equally illuminated. So if we looked at this under a waveform monitor, they should be hitting at the same level. That's the kind of sort of fingerprint, if you like. That's the mark that's left by a colorist who's really carefully considering where a viewer's eye is being taken within a scene. So there really are just, endless examples here I've got of how big, large, high contrast windows and the motivated light from those is used to really create depth to these scenes. And just to finish off here with the crown, here's a really nice example of color contrast as well. The color of these flowers, it's no accident how they sit opposite. You've got yellow and blue sitting directly opposite each other on the color wheel. Blue in the center, symmetrical framing, yellow flowers in this huge sort of abundance on either side flanking the main character, gold detail, the white dress. Each of those things is helping the palette that's been chosen to really shine. The whites, they show off because they're so clean, in the same way that our kitchen is allowing our colors to kind of ping where we need them to because it's clean, it's not competing. And then you've got those complementary colours drawing the eye. Instead of the kind of warm orange and teals, here you've got the more sort of royal blue and crisp yellow, these sort of lemon yellows. It's the same principle, it's just literally rotated round on the colour wheel. Just such an effective use of, in this case, colour to balance out the shot, to create the kind of depth that we're looking for. So these aren't colours that are forcing you to feel a certain way about flowers or feel a certain way about Claire Foy. They're colours that are used to add depth, and that's where colour grading to add depth can just be such a powerful tool.